the Andromeda sector's most prestigious institution of higher learning, the Interstellar Academy of Strategic Studies, had been producing the galaxy's finest military minds, diplomats, and combat specialists for approximately 4,000 standard cycles. That's roughly 6,000 Earth years, give or take a century. Because honestly, who's counting when you've got species that live for millennia attending freshman orientation alongside beings whose entire civilization rises and falls in the span of what others consider a long weekend? The Academy prided itself on diversity, which was a polite way of saying they'd accept anyone with enough credits or political backing, regardless of how many limbs, heads, or dimensional phases they possessed. The campus sprawled across 3 interconnected space stations orbiting a dwarf star that nobody had bothered to name because it was, frankly, unremarkable. Much like the star, the Academy's architecture was functional rather than inspired. Gray metal corridors connected training facilities, lecture halls, dormitories, and the 13 different cafeterias required to accommodate the dietary needs of species ranging from photosynthetic chlorins, who literally ate sunlight, to the Morthacs, who required liquefied minerals that would dissolve most other species on contact. It was organized chaos, a controlled experiment in seeing how many different types of sentient beings you could cram into confined spaces before someone started an interplanetary incident, which happened, on average, twice per semester. The unspoken hierarchy at the Academy was as rigid as it was predictable. At the top sat the Corinthians, a warrior race standing between 7 and 9 feet tall, built like someone had taken the concept of a heavyweight boxer and added extra muscle groups just for aesthetic purposes. Their homeworld had 3 times Earth's gravity, and they'd spent the last 50,000 years perfecting the art of breaking things with their bare hands. Just below them were the Varathian Collective, a hive-minded species that brought the phrase, "we think alike," to uncomfortable new levels. Then came about 40 other species, each with their own claims to superiority based on technological advancement, psionic abilities, or really impressive military conquest records. And then, at the very bottom of this cosmic food chain, sat humanity. Earth had stumbled into the galactic community a mere 73 years ago, when a faster-than-light experiment had gone spectacularly wrong and accidentally punched a hole straight into a major shipping lane. The Galactic Council, in their infinite wisdom and even more infinite bureaucracy, had decided that instead of glassing the planet for the inconvenience, they'd extend an invitation to join galactic society. This was primarily because Earth occupied a strategically useful position near several resource-rich systems, and secondarily because the Council loved appearing magnanimous, made for great publicity. The general consensus among the established galactic powers was that humans were adorable in the way a 3-legged puppy is adorable. Plucky, determined, but ultimately doomed to remain permanent underdogs. They came from a light gravity world with a single moon, lacked any natural armor or weapons beyond some reasonably sharp teeth, and their average lifespan was laughably short by galactic standards. They'd only recently figured out how to leave their own solar system, for crying out loud. Most species had achieved that while humans were still banging rocks together and getting excited about fire. But the Council had a diversity quota to maintain. So human students started trickling into institutions like the Academy. They were generally relegated to administrative tracks, technical positions, or xenobiology studies. The kind of careers where you needed a good memory and steady hands, rather than the ability to rip a security door off its hinges. Nobody expected much from them in the combat disciplines. Why would they? Basic biology suggested humans would get pulverized in any physical confrontation with species that had evolved under harsher conditions. This was the conventional wisdom, widely accepted and rarely questioned. which made what was about to happen in Training Hall 7 all the more entertaining. The facility was a massive circular arena, roughly 200 meters in diameter, with a reinforced floor capable of withstanding the impact of a small orbital strike. The ceiling arched 60 feet overhead, studded with lighting arrays that could simulate everything from the harsh glare of a binary star system to the perpetual twilight of a rogue planet. Around the perimeter, observation platforms held clusters of students not currently participating in the day's exercises, along with medical stations staffed by the long-suffering personnel who had to patch up the inevitable injuries that came from teaching young beings how to efficiently harm each other. The current class, Tactical Close Quarters Combat 3, was a mandatory course for all students in the Strategic Operations track. It was taught by instructor Vecthor, a grizzled Vorathian who'd spent 2 centuries in the Galactic Defense Forces before retiring to the substantially less dangerous job of teaching teenagers how to throw proper punches. He possessed 4 arms, compound eyes that could track multiple targets simultaneously, and a teaching philosophy that boiled down to try not to kill your sparring partner. But if you do, there's paperwork. Approximately 60 students formed loose clusters around the arena floor, representing a solid cross-section of the Academy's species diversity. Most had already been through their warm-up routines, which varied wildly depending on physiology. The Corinthians were doing what looked like powerlifting exercises with weights that could crush a small vehicle. The Sekari, a reptilian species with particularly flexible spines, were contorting themselves into shapes that would make a human yoga instructor weep with envy. The Chlorans were literally just standing in a sunbeam, looking smug about it, and off to one side, stretching with economical movements that suggested someone who knew exactly what their body could do was the human. She stood approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall, which translated to laughably short by Corinthian standards and averaged to tall among most other species. Her build was lean muscle over a compact frame, the kind of physique that came from practical application rather than aesthetic bodybuilding. Dark hair pulled back in a tight braid, skin a few shades darker than the Academy's standard-issue gray training uniform, and eyes that tracked the room with the kind of awareness that suggested she was cataloging every exit, every potential weapon, and every student who might cause problems. Her name was Keiko Martinez, though she'd answer to just Martinez in the clipped military style she'd grown up with. 22 standard Earth years old, which made her a relative infant compared to classmates who were celebrating their 5th decade of life. She'd earned her spot at the Academy through a combination of academic excellence, a tactical aptitude that had impressed even the xenophobic evaluators, and a scholarship program designed to promote interspecies cooperation and understanding, which was fancy talk for we need to look like we're giving everyone a fair shot. She'd been at the Academy for 8 months. In that time, she'd kept her head down, maintained top marks in her theory classes, and carefully avoided drawing attention to herself in the practical courses. This was partly strategic and partly survival instinct. Humans who got too confident too quickly tended to end up in the medical bay with injuries that took weeks to heal, because species that could shrug off broken bones didn't always remember to pull their punches when facing someone significantly more fragile. The smart play was to be competent but not threatening, capable but not cocky, good enough to pass but not good enough to make anyone feel challenged. Martinez had been playing it smart for 8 months. Today, that was about to change in a spectacular fashion. Instructor Vecthor's voice boomed across the training hall, amplified by the facility's sound system because his natural voice would have been inaudible to half the species present. Attention, students. Today we continue our focus on adaptive combat techniques. You will be paired with partners from different species classifications. Your objective is to demonstrate practical application of the principles we've covered regarding physiological advantage assessment and tactical compensation, which was educational jargon for figure out how to fight someone who doesn't have the same biological setup as you, and try not to embarrass yourself. A holographic display materialized in the center of the arena, listing the day's pairings. Students craned their various necks, heads, and optical stalks to see who they'd been matched with. There were groans, cheers, and in one case, what might have been a mating call, but was probably just excitement. Hard to tell with the Dravek sometimes. Martinez found her name on the list and felt something cold settle in her stomach. She was paired with Krath Zin, a Corinthian male who stood 8 feet 3 inches of solid muscle and casual arrogance. He was in his 4th year at the academy, captain of the combat sports team, and possessed a record in the sparring arena that included 47 wins, 0 losses, and 3 opponents who'd required reconstructive surgery. He came from a military dynasty on Crinthos Prime, the kind of family where disappointing your ancestors meant you'd literally failed to live up to several thousand years of warrior tradition. He was also, by all accounts, a complete ass. Martinez had heard the stories, how he'd accidentally broken a Sakari student's arm during a grappling exercise, how he referred to non-warrior species as clerks with delusions, how he'd loudly proclaimed that humans had no business in combat courses and should stick to positions where their fragility wouldn't be a liability to real soldiers. He'd been disciplined twice for excessive force during training, given warnings about his conduct, and had absolutely not learned anything from the experience, except that the Academy's punishment system was more bark than bite. Across the arena floor, Krath Zin saw the pairing and laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. It was the kind of laugh that suggested someone had just told him he'd won the lottery and could also kick a puppy without consequences. He nudged one of his friends, a Corinthian female named Thresika, and said something that made her laugh too. They were looking directly at Martinez while they did it. The message was clear. This was going to be humiliating. Around them, other students noticed the pairing. A Chloran named Vesper, who'd been friendly to Martinez in Xenobiology 12, gave her a sympathetic look that translated roughly to, "Good luck not dying." A Varathian student actually started toward the instructor, probably to suggest a different pairing, but stopped when Martinez shook her head fractionally. No point in making a fuss. That would just make it worse. The betting pools started immediately. The Academy officially frowned upon students gambling on training exercises, which meant it happened constantly through encrypted networks that the administration pretended not to know about. Martinez could see several students surreptitiously checking their data pads, placing wagers on how quickly she'd go down. The odds were not in her favor. Most bets clustered around under 30 seconds, with a few optimistic souls stretching to maybe a full minute if she runs really fast. Nobody bet on the human winning. That would have been stupid. Instructor, Vekthor called the first group of pairs to their designated combat circles. Martinez and Krath Zin were in the third grouping, which gave her a few minutes to watch the other matches and remind herself exactly why she'd been trying to avoid this scenario. A Morthax student went up against a Sakari, and the fight was over in seconds when the Morthax used their superior strength to simply overwhelm their opponent's flexibility advantage. A Varathian pair demonstrated impressive coordination, their compound eyes and 4 arms making them formidable grapplers who could attack and defend simultaneously. Then it was time. Martinez walked to her assigned circle, a 15-meter diameter ring marked out on the arena floor. Krath Zin took his position across from her with the casual confidence of someone who'd done this hundreds of times and won every single one. Up close, he was even more imposing. His gray-blue skin had the texture of rough stone, covered in what might have been decorative scarification or might have been actual battle scars. Hard to tell with Corinthians, who considered both equally prestigious. His eyes were solid black, no visible pupil or iris, which most species found unsettling. He wore the standard training uniform modified for his physiology, which meant reinforced seams and approximately 3 times more material than Martinez's outfit used. Instructor Vector moved between them, his forearms held in the neutral position that signaled he was officiating. Standard rules apply. Combat continues until submission, incapacitation, or my intervention. Lethal techniques are prohibited. Excessive force will result in immediate disqualification and disciplinary action. His compound eyes fixed on Krath-Zin for that last part, which was about as subtle as a brick through a window. The objective is demonstrating technique, not settling personal grievances. Understood. Understood, instructor, Martinez said clearly. Her voice was calm, professional, giving away nothing. Krath-Zin grunted something that might have been agreement. Take your positions. They moved to opposite sides of the circle. Around them, the other matches had paused as students realized something interesting was about to happen. Word had spread fast. Human versus Corinthian. David and Goliath. Except David had left his sling at home and Goliath had been hitting the gym. This was either going to be a very quick lesson in humility or a medical emergency waiting to happen. Martinez rolled her shoulders, loosening muscles that knew exactly what was coming. She'd been preparing for this moment since the day she'd arrived at the academy. Not specifically this moment, not specifically Krath-Zin, but something like it. The inevitable confrontation when playing it safe was no longer an option. When someone would push, and she'd have to decide whether to fold or push back. She'd grown up in a military family on Earth. Her mother had been a Marine Corps combat instructor. Her father had taught Krav Maga to special operations units. Her childhood had been kata practice before breakfast, grappling drills after school, and dinner table conversations about the best way to disarm an opponent who had reach advantage. Other kids had played soccer. Martinez had learned 17 different ways to break someone's grip and at least 8 methods of turning an attacker's momentum against them. Her parents had taught her something the galactic community hadn't quite figured out about humans yet. Yeah, they were from a light gravity world. Yeah, they lacked natural armor or weapons. Yeah, they were physically weaker than most species they'd encounter out in the galaxy. But humans had spent their entire evolutionary history being weaker than the things trying to eat them. They'd survived not by being the strongest or the fastest, but by being the most creative, the most adaptable, and the most absolutely unhinged when cornered. Humanity had looked at a planet full of creatures with bigger teeth, sharper claws, and better armor, and decided, we're going to domesticate you, hunt you to extinction, or turn you into a coat. Sometimes all 3. And in the process, they'd gotten really good at fighting dirty. The galaxy hadn't figured this out yet because most humans in the academy were too smart to demonstrate it. Why volunteer to get your ass kicked when you could just avoid the fight entirely? Why prove you could take a punch when it was easier to simply not be where the punch was landing? Most human students followed this eminently sensible philosophy. Martinez had followed it too, right up until Krath-Zin had opened his mouth 3 weeks ago in the cafeteria and loudly proclaimed that humans were evolutionary participation trophies, who'd gotten lucky with opposable thumbs and language skills, but would have been extinct in a generation on any real world. She'd let it go. Picked up her tray, walked away, been the bigger person. Then yesterday, he'd accidentally shoved her into a wall hard enough to leave bruises, muttered something about watching where she was going, and laughed when she'd picked herself up without responding. So yeah, She was done being smart. Time to be something else. Begin. Instructor Vekthor's voice cracked across the arena. Krathzine didn't waste time with strategy or assessment. Why would he? This was a human, fragile, weak, barely worth the effort. He crossed the distance between them in 3 massive strides and threw a punch that had approximately 0 technique behind it, because he didn't need technique. He had mass, strength, and reach. That was enough. It would have been enough against most opponents. Martinez wasn't most opponents. She'd already moved before his fist reached where her head had been. Not a panicked dodge or a desperate scramble, but a precise sidestep that took her exactly far enough to avoid the blow while keeping her inside his reach. Krathzine's punch hit empty air, with enough force that the displacement actually made a sound, a low whoomp like someone shaking out a heavy carpet. His eyes widened fractionally. Surprise. The human was faster than she looked. He adjusted, throwing a follow-up combination, left hook toward her ribs, right straight toward her center mass. Basic stuff, aggressive and overwhelming. Martinez slipped the hook, ducked under the straight, and her fist impacted his solar plexus with a precise strike that had her full body weight behind it. The effect was minimal. Hitting Krathzine's torso was like punching a stone wall. His skin was thick enough that human knuckles would break before doing any real damage. But Martinez wasn't trying to hurt him with that strike. She was testing resistance, gauging density, confirming what she'd suspected about Corinthian physiology. Dense muscle, thick skin, skeletal structure reinforced for high-gravity environments. Heavy, durable, powerful, also slow. Not by Corinthian standards, but by human standards. By the standards of a species that had evolved on a world where the predators were fast enough that being slow meant being food. Krathzine snarled and pressed forward, throwing another combination. Martinez gave ground, circling, staying mobile. Around them, the watching students had gone quiet. This wasn't following the expected script. The human should be on the ground already, overwhelmed by the first rush. Instead, she was moving like water, always just ahead of strikes that should have connected. Krathzine was getting frustrated. Martinez could see it in the tension of his shoulders, the way his attacks were getting more aggressive and less controlled. Frustration was good. Frustration led to mistakes. He committed to a big overhand right, the kind of punch that would have cratered concrete if it landed. Martinez didn't try to block it or even slip it. She stepped inside his reach, closing the distance instead of creating it, and drove her elbow into his inner thigh. There was a nerve cluster there. Same location across most humanoid species, and hitting it right caused intense pain and temporary numbness. Krathzine's leg buckled slightly. Not much, just a momentary weakness, but enough. Martinez was already moving, transitioning from the elbow strike into a sweeping leg technique that caught his weakened leg and twisted. Basic judo principle. Use the opponent's weight against them. All 8 feet and 3 inches of Krathzine went down like a falling tree. The impact shook the floor. The arena went completely silent. Krathzine rolled immediately, training overriding surprise, coming back to his feet with murder in his black eyes. The friendly sparring match, if it had ever been that, was over. This was personal now. A human had put him on the ground. A human. The shame of it was intolerable. He charged without technique, without strategy, just raw aggression fueled by wounded pride. Martinez stood her ground until the last possible second. Then moved. Not away, but toward him and to the side, redirecting his momentum with a hip throw that sent him stumbling past her. As he went by, Her elbow found his kidney. Corinthians had 3 of them, distributed throughout their lower torso for redundancy. But the principle was the same. Hit it hard enough and it hurt like hell. Krath-Zin roared. Actual roaring, the kind that came from a throat designed to intimidate prey across a 300-meter valley. He spun, fast despite his size, and his backhand caught Martinez across the shoulder. She rolled with the impact, letting it push her back instead of resisting, but the force was still tremendous. Her arm went numb from shoulder to fingertips. Blood hit the floor. Martinez's blood, from where Krath-Zin's stone-like knuckles had split the skin at her shoulder. Not a serious injury, but definitely against the spirit of a training exercise. Instructor Vector moved forward, 2 of his 4 hands raised to call the match. Martinez waved him off with her good hand. Not done yet. Krath-Zin smiled, finally drew some blood. Now the human would fold, submit, beg for intervention. That's what they did. That's what they all did when confronted with real strength. Martinez wiped blood off her shoulder with 2 fingers, looked at it for a moment, then looked at Krath-Zin with an expression that made several watching students suddenly very uncomfortable. It wasn't fear or pain or even anger. It was assessment. Clinical, detached evaluation, like she was looking at a problem that required a specific solution. They circled each other. Krath-Zin was breathing hard now, more from rage than exertion. Martinez's breathing was controlled, measured, the rhythm of someone who'd done cardio training until their body could maintain efficiency under stress. He came in again, more careful this time, trying to grab rather than strike. Grappling was a Corinthian specialty. Get a solid hold, use the strength advantage, force submission. Martinez let him catch her wrist, felt the grip tighten like a vice, and instead of pulling away, she stepped in and up, using his own grip as leverage to drive her knee into his face. Corinthian faces were reinforced bone and cartilage. Her knee impacted like hitting a wall. But even reinforced noses had limits, and Martinez had put everything she had into that strike. She felt something give. Krath-Zin's head snapped back. Blood started flowing from his nose, darker than human blood, almost purple. He released her wrist reflexively, hands going to his face. Martinez didn't give him time to recover. She transitioned immediately into a spinning back kick that caught him in the knee, the joint that was structurally similar across most bipedal species because there were only so many ways to engineer a load-bearing hinge. His leg buckled again, and this time Martinez followed up with a straight punch to his throat. Not hard enough to crush anything, but hard enough to make breathing difficult. Hard enough to trigger the body's panic response, the ancient mammalian brain screaming about oxygen deprivation. Krath-Zin went down on one knee, gasping. The arena was pandemonium now. Students shouting, some in their native languages, others in galactic standard. Half were cheering, the other half were horrified. The betting pools had crashed completely. This wasn't possible. Humans didn't win against Corinthians. The physics didn't work. The biology didn't support it. This violated approximately 17 different assumptions about species capability ratings. And yet, there was Krath-Zin, on one knee, blood running from his nose, gasping for air. And there was Martinez, standing over him, breathing hard but still on her feet, still ready. Instructor Vector was moving toward them, all 4 hands raised now, definitely stopping this before it went further. Medical personnel were already rushing toward the circle with scanners and emergency supplies. The match was over. Krath-Zin looked up at Martinez with an expression that cycled through disbelief, rage, and finally something that might have been respect. Grudging, resentful respect, but respect nonetheless. Martinez offered him a hand up, not mocking, not gloating, just the gesture that came at the end of a match between equals. He stared at it for a long moment, pride warring with practicality, then took it. She helped haul him to his feet, which was mostly symbolic since he outweighed her by at least 200 pounds. But the gesture mattered. "Good fight," she said quietly. "Only for him." Krathzine grunted, still catching his breath. Then, almost grudgingly, "You hit like a Corinthian." Coming from him, from his species, that was probably the highest compliment possible. Martinez nodded acceptance, then stepped back as the medical team swarmed in to check the damage. Her shoulder was killing her now that the adrenaline was wearing off, and she suspected she'd have spectacular bruises tomorrow. Worth it, though. Absolutely worth it. The rest of the class was chaos. Instructor Vekthor tried to restore order and continue with the remaining matches, but nobody was paying attention. All eyes were on Martinez as she headed to the medical station for her own evaluation. Students she'd never spoken to were suddenly trying to catch her eye, nodding acknowledgement. The Chloron, Vesper, gave her an enthusiastic, multi-limbed gesture that translated to roughly, "That was awesome." By the time Martinez left the training hall 2 hours later, shoulder bandaged and medical release granted, the story had already spread beyond the class. By evening, it would be all over the academy. By the next morning, it would have reached every corner of campus, embellished and enhanced with each retelling. The human who'd put a Corinthian on the floor. The little human who'd made one of the warrior elite bleed. David and Goliath, except David had forgotten his sling and decided fists would work just fine. Martinez returned to her dormitory to find 17 messages waiting, including 3 formal challenges to matches, 4 requests for training partnership, and 1 rather worrying inquiry about whether she'd be interested in joining an underground fighting circuit that the academy definitely didn't know about. She ignored all of them, took a very long shower, and collapsed into her bunk with every muscle screaming. Tomorrow would bring consequences. Krathzine had friends, allies, people who'd be offended on his behalf. The academy administration might have questions about how a friendly sparring match had ended with blood on the floor. Her scholarship status could be jeopardized if someone decided she'd been excessively violent. Tomorrow would be complicated. But tonight, lying in her bunk with her shoulder throbbing and her knuckles starting to swell, Martinez allowed herself a small smile. Worth it. 3 floors down, in a dormitory section reserved for senior Corinthian students, Krathzine sat on a reinforced bed, holding an ice pack to his face and thinking very hard about what had just happened. His friends had stopped by immediately after the medical team released him, offering condolences and suggesting various forms of revenge. But he'd sent them away. This required thought, not reaction. He'd lost. Legitimately, unambiguously lost to a human. A species he dismissed as evolutionary afterthoughts. A female who massed less than half his weight and stood a full foot shorter. She'd read his techniques, exploited his weaknesses, and systematically taken him apart like a combat puzzle she'd already solved. It was humiliating. It was also educational. Krathzine came from a warrior culture that valued strength above all, but not stupidity. Ignoring a lesson because you didn't like the teacher was how you ended up dead on some battlefield, mourned as a cautionary tale instead of honored as a hero. The human had shown him something important if he was willing to see it. Strength wasn't everything. Technique mattered, strategy mattered, adaptability mattered. The humans were new to the galactic stage, weak by most species standards, and everyone had dismissed them as irrelevant to the warrior disciplines. But if one human could do what Martinez had done, What could a trained human military force accomplish? What did Earth's combat doctrine look like when they applied that same creativity and adaptability to warfare? Suddenly, humanity seemed a lot less amusing and considerably more concerning. Krath-Zin set down the ice pack and pulled up his data pad, accessing the Academy's information networks. Time to do some research on human military history. Just out of professional curiosity, of course. Nothing to do with the nagging suspicion that the galaxy had drastically underestimated Earth's potential. Nothing to do with the growing conviction that if humans ever decided to stop being nice and start being efficient, the established powers would have a very serious problem. But that was paranoid thinking. Humans were weak, fragile, evolutionary participation trophies. Everyone knew that. Krath-Zin touched his swollen nose gingerly and pulled up the first file on human warfare, starting with something called World War II. 5 minutes later, he was deeply, profoundly concerned. Across campus, in the administrative section where Academy officials maintained offices and pretended to have everything under control, Headmaster Kuvath received the incident report from Training Hall 7 with a sigh that resonated through 3 of his 7 stomachs. Kuvath was a Trilaxian, a species known for their administrative capabilities and their complete lack of combat prowess, which made them ideal for running educational institutions where they wouldn't be tempted to join the fights they were supposed to be supervising. Another incident with Krath-Zin, he muttered, scanning the report. Then he paused, reading more carefully. Wait, the human won? His assistant, a Varathian named Kesral, who had been with him for 20 years, nodded. According to 3 independent witnesses, instructor testimony, and medical reports confirming more damage to the Corinthian student than the human. Technically, the human used excessive force by Academy standards. But given Krath-Zin's history, there's substantial argument for self-defense. Kuvath read through the report again, slower this time, trying to reconcile the data with his understanding of interspecies capabilities. This is problematic. The injury report isn't that severe. Not the injuries, the implications. Kuvath pulled up a secondary screen, accessing student records. Martinez, Keiko, human, first year in strategic operations track. Top 15% academically, unremarkable in practical courses until today. He paused. Unremarkable because she's been deliberately underperforming. You think she's been hiding her capabilities? I think she's been smart. Drawing attention as a human at this academy is generally inadvisable. Better to maintain low profile, graduate without incident, return to Earth with a credential that opens doors. Kuvath tapped his desk thoughtfully. But something changed. She stopped hiding. Question is why? Kesseral pulled up surveillance footage from the training hall, watching the match play out on holographic display. She's competent, very competent. That's not luck or adrenaline, that's training. Extensive training, Kuvath agreed, watching Martinez move with precision that spoke of thousands of hours of practice. Earth combat disciplines. I'm not familiar with them. Most aren't. Earth's been galactic for barely 70 years. Their military doctrines haven't been widely studied. Kesseral paused the footage at the moment Martinez's knee connected with Krath-Zin's face. Should we be concerned? Kuvath considered this carefully. As headmaster, his job was maintaining order, ensuring student safety, and preventing interstellar incidents that might result from students of different species deciding to settle political differences with physical violence. A human demonstrating combat capability that exceeded galactic expectations definitely qualified as potentially problematic. On the other hand, Krath Zinn had been asking for a reality check for 3 years now, and the Academy's discipline system had consistently failed to provide one. Perhaps getting humbled by a human would accomplish what official sanctions hadn't. Monitor the situation, Kuvath decided finally. If this escalates into retaliatory violence, we intervene immediately. If it remains isolated, we observe. The Council has been pressing for more human integration into strategic operations. Having proof that humans can compete in combat disciplines might be useful for political purposes. You're going to use this as a recruitment tool. I'm going to use this as a teaching opportunity, Kuvath corrected. For everyone who witnessed it and everyone who hears about it. The galaxy operates on assumptions, Kesseral. Assumptions about which species are strong, which are weak, which deserve respect, and which can be dismissed. Sometimes those assumptions need updating. He closed the report and filed it under educational incidents, non-critical, rather than disciplinary actions required. The human had defended herself competently against an opponent with a history of excessive force. That was practically textbook appropriate response. If certain students learned from this that maybe they shouldn't make assumptions based purely on species classification, well, that was just good education in action. Anything else requiring immediate attention? Kuvath asked. The Dravek Harmony delegation arrives tomorrow for facility inspection. They're considering sending students next cycle. Excellent. Make sure they see Training Hall 7, and make sure they hear the story about today's match. Kuvath allowed himself a small smile, which looked unsettling on a Trilaxian face that hadn't evolved for expressing emotion. Let's give them something to think about. The story spread through the Academy with the speed and enthusiasm of really good gossip, which is to say, faster than official communications and with considerably more entertainment value. By the next morning, everyone knew. The details varied wildly depending on who was telling the story. Some versions had Martinez defeating 3 Corinthians simultaneously. Others claimed she'd used forbidden techniques from Earth's deadliest martial arts. One particularly creative account suggested she'd channeled ancient warrior spirits through meditation and combat chanting. The truth was impressive enough without embellishment, but nobody let that stop them. Martinez found herself suddenly, uncomfortably famous. Students who'd previously ignored her now wanted to talk, to ask questions, to associate themselves with the human who'd accomplished the impossible. She handled it with the same calm competence she'd demonstrated in the arena, polite but not encouraging, friendly but maintaining distance. The challenges kept coming. Every hotshot who thought they could restore Corinthian honor, every warrior species student who wanted to test themselves against the human, every person looking to make a name by defeating the Academy's newest celebrity. Martinez declined them all. She'd made her point. No need to keep proving it. Besides, her shoulder hurt like hell, and the medical team had strongly suggested she avoid strenuous activity for at least a week. The betting pools had recalibrated. Human capabilities were being reassessed across the board. Quietly, discreetly, the Academy's Strategic Operations Department started recruiting more human applicants. Earth's military academies received inquiries about their training methods, their combat philosophies, their techniques. The galaxy was learning, slowly, what Earth had always known. Humanity might be weak by most species standards. They might lack natural weapons, armor, or extraordinary physical capabilities. They might come from a light-gravity world without significant evolutionary pressure. But they'd survived anyway. They'd thrived. They'd looked at a universe full of things stronger, faster, and more dangerous than themselves, and decided that wasn't a reason to quit. It was just another problem requiring a creative solution. and humans were very, very good at creative solutions, especially when someone threw the first punch. 3 months later, Krathzin and Martinez were training partners, her teaching him technique and adaptability, him teaching her how to optimize for strength differentials. It was mutually beneficial and deeply uncomfortable for both of them. But they were professionals. They could work together, even if they'd never be friends. 6 months later, the first joint human-Corinthian combat unit was being discussed at the council level, combining human tactical flexibility with Corinthian raw power. The proposal was controversial, but gaining traction. 1 year later, Martinez graduated in the top 3% of her class, with multiple offers from prestigious military organizations across the galaxy. She chose Earth Defense Forces, returned home, and disappeared into the kind of special operations work that doesn't generate paperwork or leave records. But the story persisted. The human who'd put a Corinthian on the floor. The match that changed assumptions. The moment the galaxy realized that maybe, just maybe, they'd underestimated Earth. It became a teaching example at the Academy, used in first-year orientation to remind students that species classification doesn't determine individual capability, that assumptions can be dangerous, that underestimating an opponent because of their biology is an excellent way to end up bleeding on a training hall floor while they stand over you. Breathing hard, but still standing, the galaxy learned its lesson slowly, reluctantly, with considerable resistance from those who preferred the old, comfortable hierarchies. But they learned. And humanity? They kept doing what they'd always done. Surviving, adapting, thriving in environments that should have killed them by any reasonable metric. Being simultaneously fragile and ridiculously stubborn. Refusing to quit just because the odds said they should. Being, in short, exactly what they'd always been. Human. And that, as Krathzin learned while nursing a broken nose and wounded pride, was considerably more dangerous than anyone had given them credit for. The galaxy had thrown the first punch, dismissing humanity as irrelevant. Humanity had ended it with blood on the floor and the whole galaxy watching. Fair warning had been given. What happened next was entirely up to them.